capitalism as such, the ultimate method perhaps of socialising costs? In the name of exploring these questions, this paper examines the Industrial Revolution as the end product of a centuries-long process of primitive capital formation or primitive accumulation. It examines the role of the processes associated with primitive accumulation in expediting the rise of capitalist modalities to global dominance following the Industrial Revolution. It seeks thereby to account for the socialisation of the costs through blame shifting and scapegoating as the ultimate means of guaranteeing the benefits of class privilege and, unfortunately, of future climate crisis. The origins of the Capitalocene. In historical nature, the Industrial Revolution can be understood, as Wallerstein points out, as the end of a process, rather than the beginning of one. It traces back to the catastrophes of 14th century Europe. The Great Flood of 1314 to 17 begat massive crop failure, leading to famine, mass impoverishment, and tinderbox conditions for pandemic, which arrived with seeming inevitability in the form of the Black Death of 1346 to 53. European society was already in crisis at that time as the demands of supporting an idle manorial class put ever greater stress on production. Conditions exacerbated at least in part by an ability to raise productivity by innovating in methods of production. Population growth exacerbated this systemic crisis until the death of a third to a half of all Europe shifted the balance of power from landowner to labourer, precipitating the steady breakdown of feudal bonds. Famine and pandemic produced large-scale religious dissent and outright apostasy or rejection of religion, as the European peasantry abandoned belief in a higher plan, religious plan, obviously. Heightened class struggle and a generalised contest over the future direction of the European economy ensued. In the midst of these generalised class antagonisms, the European witch hunts of approximately 1450 to 1750 made their first appearances, as the Catholic hierarchy and other landed interests laboured to buttress their very earthly power and against dissent, heterodoxy, apostasy and social rebellion with a theocratic terror. For this, a blame-shifting counter-narrative was necessary. This appeared in the form of the allegation of the catastrophes of the 14th century of the work of witches, or brides of Satan. This narrative shifted blame for the wretched conditions of the mass under the feudal class structure that allowed the bubonic plague to reach pandemic proportions onto the victims. As Silvia Federici has demonstrated in her critical work on the subject, the European witch hunts thus served to subdue a rebellious peasantry, while enacting a program of social engineering in aid of the broader progress of primitive capital accumulation and appropriation of cheap labour. This was to be based around imposing patriarchal familial relations on peasant women through the confinement to performing social reproductive functions as broodmares for capital, an essential facet of consolidating the foundations of the nascent capitalist economy. As it was developed by the dominant classes of the period between the end of the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, the process of primitive accumulation took three main forms, all of which involved either exploitation or appropriation. The first was colonisation of feudal commons via enclosures, an act that forced the peasantry off the land, first into agrarian wage labour and then into the cities to become wage slaves in industry. Secondly, colonisation of military and conquered and resource-rich imperial possessions overseas for exploitation of cheap natures in the form of free land and the free labour of enslaved human resources. And thirdly, colonisation of the female body as a means of breeding factory fodder for exploitation industry and war fodder for the military acquisition of colonial possessions, subjugation of women in general to a patriarchal social order in the name of raising an army of broodmares for capital and the state. For its part, it's clear that the example of the European witch hunts that it's clear from the example of the European witch hunts that the very brutal and violent terror needed to break down female resistance to capitalist patriarchy as one front in a general class war aimed at successful primitive accumulation required binary written pretexts as a means of moral rationalisation as an institutional imperative. If at the core of the theocratic terror of the European witch hunts was the binary logic dividing the world into believers and heretics, and such binaries were also key facets of other fronts in the class war over the future socio-economic development of European society. Colonialism and slavery required the enabling binary of civilization versus barbarians, heathens and savages, cowboys and Indians. One that sought to explain away colonial land theft as a reflection of a moral failing on the part of the victims, on the one hand, and on the other as the service being done to them by the usurpers in usurpers and bringing them the supposed benefits of Christian civilization. In the case of the enclosures, a binary logic inspired by the paranoid, covetous logic of private property lionised usurpers of the commons as title holders, while maligning the dispossessed, ironically enough, as thieves. It demonised and criminalised those trying to survive in the wake of what Polanyi called a revolution of the rich against the poor and a uniform catastrophe, as somehow lacking respect for the rights of others. Patent projection and a general indication of the tenor of ideological rationalisations of private property to come. In all three examples, binary logic accompanied the extension of primitive capitalist accumulation to all parts of society until they reached a critical mass during the Industrial Revolution. At this point, the primitive forms of accumulation and appropriation snowballed into private accumulation and imperialism, a process that appears to constitute its greater historical significance. Theories of scapegoating. If binary logic enabled the extension of primitive accumulation to all parts of society through objectification of that which was to be appropriated and exploited, then it also enabled the shifting of blame for the harm done onto the victims. This was the crucial means of rationalising theocratic persecution, colonial invasion, land theft, slavery and genocide, typically rationalised, as we've seen, as the gifting of civilization to heathen races, for example, the defence of Christian values against the agents of Satan. One of the main problems with coming to terms with scapegoating as a historical phenomenon is that it involves deception as a matter of characterisation and has generally only been able to identify long after the fact. The paradox around scapegoating appears via the fact that while few will ever admit to participating in it, scapegoating remains a dominant theme historically, one of the main forms perhaps in which history tends to repeat itself. Help in seeing through such deception and overcoming the associated paradoxes come through sociological research into moral panics, which concerns itself with ideological narratives in which a condition, episode, person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Stanley Cohen, author of the seminal Folk Devils and Moral Panics, described the process of engineering moral panics as deviance amplification, a description based on the subjective basis of the concept of deviance. Cohen notes in particular that the nature of deviance depends on who had the power to define the meaning of the word and to impose that definition on popular discourse, rather than the characteristics of anyone else labelled. Where the power exists to impose subjective definitions on public discourse, Cohen argues, the process of labelling deviance becomes the basis for scare campaigns built around demonised bogeymen or folk demons who would trigger fight or flight responses that could then be harnessed for ideological ends. Under conditions of formal democracy, for example, the power to label deviance rests in corporate media hegemony, which, as Chomsky and Herman have demonstrated, provides in this instance for the manufacture of consent. Social control leads to deviance, Cohen points out, not the other way around. Deviance production was then, by definition, an elite-controlled process, given the prior requirement that one possess control over the channels of mass communication in order to effect it. Research in social psychology helps us to clarify the process of deviance production. In particular, the process known as moral disengagement refers to the subjective mechanisms we use to reconstruct unethical, immoral, harmful, dangerous, or even criminal actions as morally just and right, with a view to neutralising the self-censor of our conscience. This approach recognises that we rarely reject the idea of morality out of hand, but merely apply it selectively. Upholding the idea of ourselves as moral actors on the basis of selective application of principle, we were enabled to, by various fallacious pretexts for the sake of momentary expediency, all which fall under the banner of moral disengagement. Broadly, the mechanisms of moral disengagement include displacement or diffusing of responsibility. Everyone does it, it's normal, I was just following orders. 2, misrepresenting injurious consequences is beneficial to the victim, they like it, it's good for them, tough love. 3, demonising and dehumanising the victim, they are bad, evil, therefore the rules we have for regular people don't apply. 4, articulating a self-defence in morally absolute terms. Those who aren't for us are against us. Those who aren't for me are against me, willing conflation of criticism with ideas, attitude, conduct, policy, and attacks on person and rights. The logic of the false dilemma. If you think for yourself, the terrorists win. insofar as it constitutes a form of dehumanizing or demonizing the other as a means of othering, deviance production per se can be seen as a form of moral disengagement. To the extent that this is the case, moral disengagement constitutes a characteristic facet of moral panics. While not all forms of moral disengagement appear in every episode of moral panic, deviance production as such will always depend on the false dilemma fallacy, being as this the basis for the victim complex that incorporates all the others. To state the situation somewhat differently, moral disengagement might be regarded as the inner macro side of the process of scapegoating, that situated within the scapegoater. This is worth keeping in mind when we consider that deviance production is as much about those who label and stereotype as it is about those being labelled and stereotyped. With moral disengagement dynamics operating on the macro level, deviance production and moral panic function as at a practical level in the exterior realm to effect shifting of blame. In this way, can the logic informing the socialisation of costs as a method of scapegoating feature in the regime of private accumulation, as well as in the historical process that enabled it to rise to global dominance in the first place. Scapegoating is the organising principle of the Capitalocene. Witch hunting instigated by the Council of Basel, the veritable sabbat of demonologists in the mid-15th century, invoked the demon complex simultaneously reflecting deviance production and moral disengagement by willingly confusing failure to blindly believe and obey with comforting the enemy, projecting onto the peasant victims of the witch hunts blame for their own victimisation. In the same way, the stereotype of the savage enabled exactly the same victim playing and victim blaming, the mere existence of first peoples treated as a pretext for shifting onto the victims' responsibility for the violent and brutal outcomes of colonialism. Racism, with all its double standards and hypocrisies, thoroughly pervaded the institution of chattel slavery for exactly the same reason. As processes of primitive capital accumulation perpetrated in 3 to 4 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, such hypocrisies constitute the ideological foundations for expansionist violence at the various commodity frontiers, the enclosure movement, power relations between the genders, and colonial relations between European powers and their Oriental others. Theft of cheap natures, free lunches for private accumulation in the form of cheap labour, cheap food, cheap fuel and cheap resources was justified as a legitimate response to one or another existentialist threat. This was ultimately how the crisis of feudalism was resolved without threat to the class structure prevailing at the time. As Jason Moore observes, the era of primitive accumulation gave rise not only to the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of men, but also a new world praxis, cheap nature. This praxis was one of accumulating and organising not only human bodies, but of assigning their value through the humanity-nature binary. That so many humans could be reassigned to the domain of not human or not quite human allowed capitals and empires to treat them cheaply, even as this cheapening was fiercely resisted. What Moore describes here is characteristic moral disengagement, the neutralising of self-censure in the name of constructing self-serving double standards. The establishment of the new world practice of cheap nature on this basis begs the question as to the extent to which the accumulation of men also demanded what we might call the accumulation of right, appropriated for private consumption with no less a measure of violence than its physical counterparts. The history of violence surrounding the witch hunts, the enclosures and colonialism tends towards the conclusion that the demands of the nascent capitalist economy on this account were considerable, and that the accumulation of right in this sense was and remains crucial to the regime of private accumulation. The imposition of binary-laden ideological precepts with the same violence as was demonstrated in the accumulation of men as a prerequisite of this new world praxis begs the question as to the need for capital to colonise the interior world of interiorist individual subjectivity. In the era of capital, who has ideological legitimacy and who decides? Why, given the purported freedoms we enjoy under the rule of law, can we still not choose the mode of production? What happens to those who ask us such questions on a world system that assumes the moral right of class privilege as a natural right in abstract nature outside of history? Such questions indicate something of the heavily politicised notions of normality under the regime of private accumulation. These are the ones begotten by the accumulation of right, upheld by cheap biopower, and which otherwise result from the colonisation of individual subjectivity with the blame-shifting slave morality of capitalist individualism. As a form of cheap biopower, the first and last expression of this colonising of individual subjectivity is the society versus nature binary. This fact tends towards the conclusion that the human psyche has been and is another frontier of cheap nature, a form of cheap biopower in the Foucauldian sense, in that it involves appropriation by psychological violence, by propaganda lies and terror of ideological legitimacy. I'll just conclude by saying I'll have a crack at something off the cuff. I mean, in this paper I've tried to demonstrate that scapegoating has played a part in the historical development of capitalism insofar as it greased the wheels of primitive accumulation. And as the economy expands into what we might call complex accumulation after the Industrial Revolution, scapegoating mechanism stays there as a way of, managing crises, say in India, where if there's a labour unrest is met with an emergency. Even at this late stage of capitalism, I mean, look at the way the climate crisis is being dealt with. A war in Syria started as a result of, partly as a result of drought in Mesopotamia, which pushed farmers into the cities, is dealt with by demonising Assad and as a threat to world order. Refugees trying to escape the consequences of climate change used as demonised and scapegoated for the same problems. Climate scientists are accused of sort of trying to perpetrate hoaxes and undermine economic freedoms by dabbling in science. So I mean, even now, I mean, based on sort of the same binary thinking and the same false dilemma. If you criticise us, you attack us. So it has been a thing and remains a thing and is an integral part of the system. Thank you.
Our last presentation for this panel is going to be with Lawrence and from St. Joseph College and John P. Antonetti from New School for Social Research with its title Commodifying the Great Salt Bay, a World Ecological Analysis of Early 20th Century Blue Point Oyster Production.
Thank you. Hi everybody, I'm John. So today we're going to be talking about the process of commodifying the Great South Bay. And in doing so, we're going to be talking about the development of the blue point oystering industry on the south shore of Long Island. So broadly, we're taking a world ecological perspective. We're going to be looking at specific moments and bundles of moments and bundles of relationships between human and nature, extra human and extra human natures. So we'll be looking at a number of themes from the world ecological perspective, including the appropriation of unpaid work and energy, shifting frontiers and in the search for finding new cheap natures. We'll also be talking about increasing capitalization, declining ecological surpluses. So a lot of the themes from world ecology are present in this work. So in Jason Moore's work, Capitalism in the Web of Life, he kind of calls for a retelling of history from a world ecological perspective. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So I grew up in Blue Point. St. Joseph's College is like right next to Blue Point. I'll show you a whole map in a second. But so growing up, you always kind of heard these like stories about the Blue Point oyster. My grandfather was an oysterman. He used to have his boat. He used to go out. He was a self-made man. He would oyster by himself. When we look at the Blue Point oyster from a world ecological perspective, like a radically different story actually like emerges out of that. So just to frame like the size and scale and scope of the Blue Point oystering industry, something like 60% of all New York fishery like value generated in this time was from like the Blue Point oystering industry. So it's pretty massive. And it was the Blue Point oysters were very popular. There's like a story that goes out around that the Queen of England would only eat Blue Point oysters as long as the shells were sanded down smooth for her. So kind of interesting. So it's this big thing where we grow up, where I grew up. So this is the Great South Bay. Blue Point, I don't really have, kind of like right left of the middle is where Blue Point is, and that's where the majority of Blue Point oyster production took place. We're looking at 5 distinct bundles of human and extra-human relationships. Like 5 points, rough estimated points in history where these relationships change, and we're going to examine different aspects of those relationships. So there's actually 6, sorry. So let's get into them. So bundle 1 is just kind of like production for use. So native indigenous people had been using shellfish for their own personal use as far back as William Cronin talks about it in Changes in the Land, and from an unknown point in history they began that. When the English first arrived on Long Island to the Great South Bay, they would also kind of go out to these exposed oyster beds and just kind of take up oysters for their own personal use for food. So bundle 2 is what we title the independent production bundle. So here we start to see the beginnings of like the oystering industry in earnest. So they're using both human and wind energy, wind-powered sailboats to extract oysters. And we see a couple different types of relationships coming together in the Great South Bay.